It was a Tuesday morning, just like any other. The sun was barely up, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Downtown was already buzzing with people rushing to work, coffee cups in hand, briefcases swinging by their sides. The courthouse stood tall in the middle of it all, a building that had seen countless stories unfold within its walls. Inside one of the quiet neighborhoods across town, a man was getting ready for work. He stood in front of his bathroom mirror, adjusting his tie with practiced ease. This wasn't just any man. He was a judge, someone who had spent the last 15 years making sure justice was served fairly in that very courthouse. His morning routine was always the same. Wake up at 6, shower, get dressed, kiss his wife goodbye, and head out the door. His wife handed him his briefcase as he walked toward the door. "You've got that big case today, right?" she asked, pouring herself a cup of coffee. He nodded, smiling. "Yeah, but it's nothing I can't handle. Been doing this long enough." She smiled back, but there was always that little worry in her eyes. Being married to a judge meant dealing with stress that most people never had to think about. But he was good at his job, fair, honest, the kind of judge who actually listened before making decisions. He got in his car and started the drive downtown. The radio was playing some old song he remembered from college. He hummed along, his mind already going through the cases he'd be hearing that day. Traffic was light, which was a pleasant surprise. Usually this route was packed with cars. Maybe today would be a good day after all. Meanwhile, across town, another man was also getting ready for work. But this morning felt different for him. He was a police officer, had been for 12 years now. 12 years of wearing the badge, driving the patrol car and telling people what to do. He liked that part. The authority. The respect he thought he deserved just because of the uniform he wore. But lately, things had been tense at the station. There had been complaints. Lots of them, actually. People saying he was too rough, too aggressive, using too much force when he didn't need to. His supervisors had talked to him a few times, but nothing ever really came of it. They'd tell him to be more careful, to watch his temper, and then everything would go back to normal. He'd learned that if you had enough friends in the department, you could get away with a lot. Today he had to go to the courthouse. He was supposed to testify in a case, something routine. He hated going to court, all those lawyers asking questions trying to make him look bad, all those procedures and rules. He preferred being out on the street where things were simpler, where his word was law, or at least that's how he liked to think about it. He pulled up to the courthouse and parked in the spot reserved for law enforcement. Getting out of his car, he adjusted his gun belt and checked his appearance in the side mirror. The uniform always made him feel powerful. He walked toward the entrance, his boots making heavy sounds on the concrete steps. Back to the judge. He pulled into the courthouse parking lot, but something was different today. There was construction equipment everywhere. Big orange cones blocking off the usual entrance he took. A sign said the judge's private entrance was closed for repairs. He sighed. That meant he'd have to use the public entrance today, the one everyone else used. Not a big deal, really, just inconvenient. He grabbed his briefcase from the passenger seat and got out. He wasn't wearing his usual judge's robe, of course. That was something he put on once he got to his chambers. Right now he was just wearing casual business clothes. A simple shirt, slacks, nothing fancy. He preferred to keep things low-key when he wasn't in the courtroom. Some judges liked to walk around like they owned the place, but that had never been his style. As he walked toward the public entrance, he noticed how busy it was. People were lined up going through security. Lawyers chatting with their clients, police officers standing around waiting for their cases to be called. The courthouse was like its own little city in the mornings. Everyone had somewhere to be, something important to do. He walked through the main doors, his briefcase in hand. The security guards at the metal detector knew him, of course. He'd been walking through these doors for 15 years. But today they were busy with the morning rush and he didn't want to cut in line just because of who he was. So he waited his turn like everyone else. That's when the police officer spotted him. Standing there in the lobby waiting for his case to be called, the officer was bored. He'd been standing there for 20 minutes already and he hated waiting. His eyes scanned the crowd, looking at faces, sizing people up the way he always did. It was a habit he'd developed over the years. Always watching, always suspicious. Then he saw him. A man in casual clothes carrying a briefcase walking through the public entrance. The officer's eyes narrowed. Something about this guy bothered him, though he couldn't quite say what. Maybe it was the confident way he walked. Maybe it was something else entirely. But the officer felt that familiar feeling rising in his chest. That feeling that told him something wasn't right. He started walking toward the man, his hand instinctively moving closer to his belt. Other people in the lobby were going about their business, not paying attention. The lawyers were still chatting. The security guards were checking bags. Everything seemed normal. But the officer's focus was locked on this one person. The judge didn't notice at first. He was checking his phone, reading a message from his clerk about a schedule change. He was thinking about the cases he had that day, mentally preparing himself for the long hours ahead. He had no idea that someone was watching him. No idea that his routine Tuesday morning was about to become anything but routine. The officer got closer, his jaw set, his expression hard. He'd made up his mind about something, though based on what even he probably couldn't say, it was just a feeling, an assumption, the kind of snap judgment that had gotten him in trouble before, though he'd never really faced serious consequences for it. The judge looked up from his phone and started walking toward the hallway that led to the judicial chambers. He knew this building like the back of his hand. Every corridor, every courtroom, every office. This was his second home. He'd spent more waking hours here than anywhere else except his actual house. But before he could take more than a few steps, he heard a voice behind him, loud, aggressive. "Hey, where do you think you're going?" The judge turned around, confused. Was someone talking to him? He saw the officer standing there a few feet away, staring at him with an expression that was hard to read. It wasn't friendly, that much was clear. "Excuse me?" the judge said, his voice calm and polite. He was used to dealing with all kinds of people. Staying calm was part of his job. The officer stepped closer. "I asked you a question. Where are you going? What's your business here?" The judge felt a small knot form in his stomach. Something about this felt wrong. But he kept his voice steady. "I work here. I'm a judge." The morning that had started so normally was about to take a turn that no one in that courthouse could have predicted. Not the lawyers, not the security guards, not the other officers standing nearby. And certainly not the judge himself, who had simply come to work to do his job, just like he had done thousands of times before. But sometimes, that's how the worst moments begin. On ordinary mornings, when you least expect it. The officer stared at him, and for a moment there was complete silence between them. The noise of the courthouse lobby continued around them. People talking, phones ringing, the beep of the metal detector. But in that small space between the two men, everything felt frozen. "You're a judge?" The officer's voice dripped with disbelief. He looked the man up and down, taking in the casual clothes, the briefcase, the calm expression. His eyes said what his mouth didn't. He didn't believe it. Not for a second. The judge felt his heart rate pick up slightly, but he kept his composure. He'd been in tense situations before. Angry defendants, hostile witnesses, heated arguments in his courtroom. He knew how to stay calm. "Yes, I am. I've been a judge here for 15 years. The officer crossed his arms over his chest. "Yeah? Well, I've never seen you before." "That's probably because you don't work in this building every day like I do," the judge replied, keeping his tone respectful but firm. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to get to my chambers. I have cases starting soon." He turned to walk away, but the officer moved quickly, stepping directly into his path. They were close now, too close. The judge could smell the coffee on the officer's breath. Could see the way his jaw was clenched tight. "I don't think so," the officer said. "You're not going anywhere until you show me some identification." The judge took a slow breath. He could feel this situation escalating, and he wanted to defuse it before it got worse. "Of course. I have my ID right here." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his courthouse identification badge, the one with his photo, his name, and the word judge printed clearly across the top. He held it up so the officer could see it. For a moment, the officer just stared at it. His expression didn't change. He didn't apologize. Didn't step aside. If anything, he seemed to get more agitated. "This could be fake," the officer said, not even bothering to look at it closely. The judge felt a flash of frustration but pushed it down. "It's not fake. You can verify it with courthouse security if you'd like. Or you can call my clerk. Or you can just let me go to work." By now, other people in the lobby were starting to notice. A few lawyers had stopped their conversations and were watching. One of the security guards at the metal detector was craning his neck to see what was happening. This was unusual. You didn't see police officers confronting people like this in the courthouse unless something serious was going on. The officer glanced around, noticing the attention they were getting, but instead of backing down, he seemed to double down, as if admitting he was wrong would be worse than continuing to make a scene. "I need to search your briefcase," he said suddenly. "Absolutely not," the judge replied, his voice still calm but now with an edge to it. "You have no legal right to search my belongings. I've identified myself. I've shown you my credentials. This is over." He tried to step around the officer again, moving to his left, but the officer moved too, blocking him once more. The judge could feel eyes on them now. The whole lobby was watching. This was becoming embarrassing. Not for him exactly, but for everyone. This wasn't how things were supposed to work in a courthouse. This was supposed to be a place of order and respect. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step back," the judge said, his voice firmer now. This was the voice he used in his courtroom when someone was out of line. But the officer wasn't in a courtroom. He was in a lobby wearing a uniform and a badge, and he felt like those things gave him the right to do whatever he wanted. "Don't tell me what to do," the officer shot back. His face was red now. The veins in his neck were visible. Whatever this was about, it had stopped being about security or identification a long time ago. This was personal, even though the two men had never met before. One of the security guards started walking over. He was an older man who'd worked at the courthouse for years. He recognized the judge immediately. "Hey, is everything okay over here?" The judge looked at him, relieved. Finally, someone with some sense. "Yes, thank you. I was just trying to get to my chambers, but this officer seems to think I'm not who I say I am." The security guard looked at the officer, confused. "That's Judge Thompson. He works here. Has for years. You'd think that would be the end of it. That the officer would apologize, maybe make some excuse about being cautious, and everyone would move on with their day. But that's not what happened. The officer's face got even redder. Being corrected in front of everyone seemed to make him angrier, not embarrassed. "I'm just doing my job," he said through gritted teeth. "Your job doesn't include harassing judges," the security guard said, his own voice getting a bit harder now. The judge held up his hand. "It's okay. I just want to go to work. This doesn't need to become a bigger issue." He moved to walk past the officer one more time. This time the officer didn't just block him with his body. He reached out and grabbed the judge's arm. Not gently, a hard grip that made the judge wince. "Let go of me," the judge said, his voice sharp now. "You're not going anywhere until I say so," the officer replied. The security guard stepped forward. "You need to let him go right now." Other courthouse staff were rushing over now. Another security guard, a bailiff who'd been standing near one of the courtrooms. People were pulling out their phones. In the corner, the security camera continued recording everything, its red light blinking steadily. The judge tried to pull his arm free, but the officer's grip tightened. "I said let go," and then everything happened so fast that people would later disagree about the exact order of events. The officer shoved the judge hard enough that he stumbled backward. The briefcase fell from his hand, hitting the marble floor with a loud crack. Papers scattered everywhere. The judge caught himself before he fell completely, but he was off balance. Shocked. In 15 years on the bench, nothing like this had ever happened to him. He'd faced threats before, sure. Angry people who didn't like his rulings. But those were always from defendants, from criminals. Never from someone who was supposed to be on the same side of the law. "What are you doing?" the judge said, his voice louder now, all pretense of calm gone. The officer didn't answer. Instead, in a moment that would be replayed on news channels for weeks to come, he kicked out. His boot connected with the judge's leg, not hard enough to break anything, but hard enough to send a clear message. Hard enough to hurt, hard enough that the judge had to grab onto a nearby bench to keep from falling. The lobby erupted. The security guards rushed forward, grabbing the officer by both arms. The bailiff was shouting something. People were yelling. A woman screamed. Lawyers were backing away, shocked expressions on their faces. The officer was still struggling against the security guards, still trying to justify what he'd just done. He was resisting. You all saw it. He was resisting. But the judge wasn't resisting anything. He was standing there, one hand on the bench, the other rubbing his leg where the officer's boot had connected. His face showed shock, pain, and something else. Disappointment, maybe. or sadness. The look of someone who'd just had their faith in something shaken. More courthouse staff came running. Someone was on a radio calling for backup. Someone else was asking if anyone needed medical attention. The whole building seemed to be converging on that one spot in the lobby. Through it all, the security cameras kept recording. Multiple angles. Perfect, clear footage of everything that had just happened. Evidence that couldn't be disputed or explained away. The officer was being pulled toward the door now, still shouting. I was just doing my job. I didn't know. He should have identified himself properly. But everyone there knew the truth. They'd all seen the ID badge. They'd all heard the security guard confirm who the judge was. They'd all watched as the situation escalated for no good reason. The judge finally straightened up, testing his leg. It hurt, but nothing was broken. A few people rushed to help him, asking if he was okay, if he needed to sit down. He waved them off gently. I'm fine. I'm okay, but he wasn't fine. Not really. And everyone there knew it. What had just happened wasn't okay. It wasn't normal. And it couldn't just be forgotten or swept under the rug. As the officer was escorted out of the building, still protesting, still making excuses, the judge looked around at all the faces staring at him. Concerned faces, angry faces, shocked faces. His Tuesday morning, which had started so peacefully, had become something else entirely. Something that would change everything. For him, for the officer, and for everyone who'd witnessed what had just happened in that courthouse lobby. The courthouse lobby had never been this quiet. Even with all the people standing around, there was an eerie silence. The kind of silence that follows something shocking, when everyone's trying to process what they just witnessed. People stood frozen, their morning routines completely forgotten. The judge bent down slowly to pick up his scattered papers. His leg was throbbing where the officer's boot had connected, but he tried not to show it. A young lawyer rushed over to help him, gathering the documents that had flown out of his briefcase. Sir, please, let me help you with that. Thank you, the judge said quietly. His hands were shaking slightly as he took the papers. He noticed the shake and tried to steady them, but the adrenaline rushing through his body made it difficult. Within minutes, the courthouse administrator came running down the hallway. She was a woman who usually handled everything with perfect composure, but right now her face was pale and her eyes were wide. What happened? Someone said there was an incident. One of the security guards filled her in quickly, his words tumbling out fast. The administrator's expression went from confused to horrified. She immediately turned to the judge. Are you hurt? Do you need medical attention? The judge shook his head. I'm all right. Just shaken up a bit. We need to get you checked out anyway, she insisted. And we need to document everything. Did anyone get video? Multiple people nodded. In today's world, everyone had a phone. At least 5 people had recorded parts of the confrontation. Plus, the security cameras had captured it all from multiple angles. The administrator pulled out her phone and started making calls. First to the police chief, then to the district attorney, then to the head of courthouse security. Each conversation was brief and urgent. You need to get down here right now. There's been an incident, a serious one. Meanwhile, out in the parking lot, 2 security guards were escorting the officer to his patrol car. He was still agitated, still trying to explain himself. You're all overreacting. I was checking someone who looked suspicious. That's my job. One of the security guards, a man who'd been with the courthouse for 20 years, shook his head. That was Judge Thompson. Everyone knows him. You assaulted a judge. The weight of those words seemed to hit the officer for the first time. His face changed. The anger drained away, replaced by something else. Fear, maybe. Or the beginning of realization about what he'd just done. I didn't know he was a judge. He told you he was, the security guard replied coldly. He showed you his ID. We confirmed it. You chose not to believe any of us. They reached the patrol car. You need to leave the premises now, and you should probably call your union rep. The officer got in his car, his movements mechanical. He sat there for a moment, staring at the steering wheel. Then he started the engine and drove away slowly. Behind him, the courthouse was already buzzing with activity as word spread about what had just happened. Back inside, the judge was sitting in a chair in the administrator's office. Someone had brought him water. Someone else had brought an ice pack for his leg. The room was filling up with people. Other judges. Court staff. Everyone wanted to see if he was okay. Everyone wanted to know what had happened. I've canceled your morning docket, the administrator said. All your cases will be rescheduled. The judge started to protest. That's not necessary. I can work. With all due respect, sir, you just got assaulted in our lobby. You're not hearing cases today. The police chief arrived 30 minutes after the incident. He was a big man with gray hair and a serious face that looked even more serious now. He came straight to the administrator's office where the judge was still sitting. Judge Thompson, he said, his voice grave. I can't tell you how sorry I am about what happened. Are you injured? Nothing serious, the judge replied. My leg's going to have a bruise, but I'll be fine. The chief pulled up a chair. I need to hear everything from you. Exactly what happened, step by step. The judge walked him through the whole thing, the construction blocking his usual entrance, using the public doors, the officer approaching him, the escalation, the grab, the shove, the kick. As he talked, the chief's expression grew darker and darker. When the judge finished, the chief was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I know that officer. He's had complaints before. A lot of them, actually. We've talked to him multiple times about his behavior. And yet he was still on duty, the judge said. It wasn't really a question. The chief looked uncomfortable. That's going to change. As of right now, he's on administrative leave pending a full investigation. And I can promise you this investigation will be thorough. The district attorney arrived next. She was younger than the judge, sharp and professional. She'd tried many cases in his courtroom over the years. Seeing him sitting there with an ice pack, looking shaken, clearly disturbed her. This is unacceptable, she said after hearing what happened. Completely unacceptable. I want to review all the security footage. I want statements from every witness. And I want to know why an officer with a history of complaints was still allowed to harass people. The judge rubbed his forehead. A headache was forming behind his eyes. I just want to understand why it happened. I showed him my ID. Security confirmed who I was. But he just kept escalating. Nobody in the room had a good answer to that question. Or maybe they did, but nobody wanted to say it out loud, not yet. Not while emotions were still running high. By noon, the story had leaked to the media. A reporter for the local news station got a tip from someone at the courthouse. Within an hour, there were camera crews outside the building. The station interrupted its regular programming with a breaking news alert. Incident at downtown courthouse, officer allegedly assaults judge. The story spread fast. Local news. Social media. Within hours, it was trending online. People were sharing the security footage that had somehow made its way onto the internet. The video was grainy but clear enough. You could see the whole confrontation. The ID being shown, the grab, the shove, the kick. The comments were immediate and divided. Some people defended the officer, saying he was just doing his job. Others were outraged, calling for his immediate firing. The debate raged across social media platforms, with everyone having an opinion about what they'd seen. At the police station, the officer sat in an interview room with his union representative. The representative was going through the security footage on a tablet, his expression growing more concerned with each viewing. This doesn't look good, the representative finally said. I know, the officer replied quietly. The anger from earlier was completely gone now. He looked tired, scared. I messed up. That's an understatement. You assaulted a judge on camera, in a courthouse full of witnesses. The officer put his head in his hands. What do I do? First, you don't talk to anyone without me present. Second, you prepare yourself. This is going to get bad, really bad. Back at the courthouse, the judge finally agreed to go get checked out by a doctor. The courthouse administrator practically forced him into a car and drove him to the emergency room herself. The ER doctor examined his leg, took some x-rays to be safe, and confirmed what they already knew. Bad bruising, but no broken bones. He'd be sore for a few days, but there was no permanent damage. Physically, you're going to be fine, the doctor said. But something like this, the psychological impact can be significant. You might want to talk to someone. The judge nodded but didn't commit to anything. He just wanted to go home, to see his wife, to try to process what had happened. When he walked through his front door that afternoon, his wife took one look at his face and knew something was terribly wrong. What happened? He told her everything. As he talked, she went from concerned to angry to horrified. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Are you okay? She finally asked. I don't know, he admitted. It was the most honest thing he'd said all day. I really don't know. She hugged him and he felt himself finally start to relax. But even in the safety of his own home with his wife's arms around him, He couldn't shake the feeling. The shock of being treated that way in the place where he'd dedicated his career. The confusion about why it had escalated so quickly. The hurt that someone had looked at him and made assumptions before he'd even spoken. His phone kept buzzing with messages. Other judges checking in. Lawyers who'd heard what happened. Friends from law school. The district attorney asking when he'd be ready to give a formal statement. News reporters requesting interviews. He turned the phone off. Outside, the news vans were already setting up in front of the courthouse, preparing for the evening broadcast. The story was just beginning, and everyone knew that what happened in that lobby wasn't just about one judge and one officer. It was about something much bigger. Something that people had been arguing about for years. Something that this incident had brought into sharp, undeniable focus. The sun was setting over the city, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. The same colors it had been that morning when the judge had left for what he thought would be an ordinary day at work. But nothing about this day had been ordinary, and nothing would ever quite be the same again. By the next morning, the story had exploded. It wasn't just local news anymore. National outlets had picked it up. Cable news channels were discussing it during their morning shows. Social media was on fire with debates, opinions, and outrage. The security footage had been viewed millions of times. The police chief called a press conference at 9 o'clock. Reporters packed into the small conference room at police headquarters, cameras rolling, notepads ready. The chief looked like he hadn't slept much. He probably hadn't. Yesterday morning, one of our officers was involved in an incident at the downtown courthouse, he began, reading from a prepared statement. The incident involved a physical confrontation with a sitting judge. The officer has been placed on immediate administrative leave without pay. An independent investigation has been launched. We are taking this matter extremely seriously. Questions erupted from the reporters. Was the officer aware he was confronting a judge? What's the officer's disciplinary history? Will he face criminal charges? Is this being investigated as a hate crime? The chief held up his hand. I can't comment on the specifics of an ongoing investigation. What I can tell you is that we are reviewing all available evidence, including security footage and witness statements. We will follow the facts wherever they lead. It wasn't enough for the reporters. It wasn't enough for the public watching at home. People wanted answers. They wanted accountability. They wanted to know how something like this could happen. At City Hall, the mayor was dealing with her own crisis. By mid-morning, protesters had gathered outside. Not a huge crowd yet, but growing. People holding signs. Justice for Judge Thompson. End police violence. Hold cops accountable. The chants echoed through the downtown streets. Inside the police department, investigators were pulling together the officers' complete personnel file. What they found was disturbing. 47 citizen complaints over 12 years. That was an unusually high number. Most officers went their entire careers with maybe 5 or 6 complaints, and those were usually minor things. 47 was a red flag that someone should have paid attention to a long time ago. The lead investigator, a detective who'd been with the department for 25 years, sat at her desk reviewing the files. Each complaint had been investigated, technically, but looking through them now, she could see the pattern. Each investigation had been minimal. Each had resulted in the same conclusion. Insufficient evidence, case closed, officer cleared. But when you looked at all 47 together, a picture emerged. Complaints about excessive force. Complaints about rude behavior. 15 separate complaints specifically mentioning racial profiling. People saying the officer treated them differently because of how they looked. All dismissed. All swept under the rug. How did this guy stay on the force? The detective muttered to herself. But she knew the answer. He had friends. He knew how to work the system. And his supervisors had decided it was easier to defend him than to deal with him. She started pulling body camera footage from some of his previous encounters. Standard procedure was to keep footage for a year before deletion. She spent hours watching clip after clip. The pattern continued. The officer approaching people aggressively, making accusations, demanding identification, getting confrontational when people questioned his authority. In one clip from 6 months ago, he'd stopped a teenager walking home from school. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" "This is my neighborhood," the kid had replied. "I live here." But the officer hadn't believed him, had demanded to see ID, had searched his backpack without permission. The whole encounter lasted 20 minutes before the kid was finally allowed to leave. No arrest, no citation, just harassment. The detective made notes of everything. This wasn't just about what happened at the courthouse. This was about a pattern of behavior that had been ignored for years. Meanwhile, the judge had decided to give a statement to the press. His attorney had advised against it, but he felt it was important. He wasn't just speaking for himself. He was speaking for everyone who'd been treated unfairly by someone with a badge. The press conference was held at the courthouse. The room was packed. Cameras everywhere. The judge sat at a table, his wife beside him, his hands folded in front of him. He looked calm, but you could see the tension in his shoulders. "Thank you all for coming," he began. "I want to address what happened yesterday. Yes, I was assaulted by a police officer in this building. Yes, it was captured on camera. Yes, I was shaken by it. But I want to be clear about something. This isn't just about me." He paused, looking directly into the cameras. "What happened to me happens to regular people every single day. The difference is I have a title. I have a position that gives me credibility. When I say I was mistreated, people believe me. When I file a complaint, it gets taken seriously. But how many other people have been treated this way and dismissed? How many complaints have been filed and ignored?" The reporters were silent, listening intently. This isn't about one bad officer. This is about a system that has failed to hold its officers accountable. It's about supervisors who look the other way. It's about complaints that get buried. It's about people who are treated with suspicion and aggression just because of how they look. His wife squeezed his hand under the table. He took a breath and continued. "I don't want sympathy. I want change. I want a real investigation, not just into this incident, but into why an officer with dozens of complaints was still allowed to wear a badge. I want to know who protected him and why, and I want to make sure that what happened to me is the last time it happens to anyone." When he finished, the room erupted with questions, but the judge stood up, thanked everyone, and left. He'd said what he needed to say. The community response was immediate. By evening, the protest outside City Hall had grown to hundreds of people. Community leaders were calling for reforms. Civil rights organizations were demanding federal oversight. The story had touched a nerve that went far beyond one incident. Inside the police union hall, officers were having their own heated discussion. Some defended their colleague, saying he'd made an honest mistake. Others were angry that his actions were making all of them look bad. The union president was caught in the middle, trying to protect the officer while also protecting the department's reputation. "We need to stand by our guy," one officer argued. "He's getting railroaded. He assaulted a judge on camera." Another shot back. "What are we supposed to do, pretend it didn't happen?" The debate went on for hours. No consensus, just division. Meanwhile, attorneys were starting to circle. Civil rights lawyers who specialized in police misconduct cases were reaching out to the judge. But others were also making calls. Lawyers representing victims of the officer's past behavior. People who'd been too scared or too discouraged to fight back before were now seeing an opportunity. One lawyer found 5 different people who'd filed complaints about the same officer. All had been dismissed. All had given up. But now, seeing what happened to a judge, they realized their complaints might finally be taken seriously. The officer himself was at home, advised by his attorney and union rep not to leave, not to talk to anyone, not to go online. But he couldn't help himself. He opened his laptop and searched his own name. The results were devastating. Thousands of articles, millions of social media posts, most of them calling for his arrest, his firing, worse. He read through some of the comments. People who'd never met him, who didn't know anything about him, were saying the worst things imaginable. Some comments he could dismiss as overreaction, but others hit closer to home. People questioning his motives. People pointing out the pattern in his complaints. People saying things he didn't want to admit might be true. His wife walked into the room. "You need to stop reading that. It's not helping." "They're destroying me," he said quietly. "You destroyed yourself," she replied. It was harsh, but it was honest. She'd warned him before, told him his temper was going to get him in trouble, told him he needed to be more careful, more professional. He hadn't listened. Back at the police department, the investigation was moving forward. The detective had compiled a thick file of evidence: the courthouse incident, the body camera footage, the complaint history, witness statements. It all pointed to the same conclusion. The police chief reviewed the file in his office late that night. He'd been a cop for 30 years. He'd seen good officers and bad ones. He'd made tough decisions before. But this one was different. This one was under a microscope. The whole country was watching. He closed the file and leaned back in his chair. Tomorrow he'd have to meet with the district attorney. They'd have to decide what charges, if any, would be filed. But looking at the evidence in front of him, the chief already knew. This wasn't going away quietly. This wasn't getting swept under the rug. This was going to trial. The next morning, the district attorney made her decision. She called another press conference. After reviewing all available evidence, my office will be filing criminal charges against Officer Peterson. He will be charged with assault and battery on a judicial officer, a felony offense. We believe the evidence clearly shows that the officer's actions were unprovoked and unjustified. The courthouse erupted in activity. Defense attorneys were already preparing. Prosecutors were building. 3 weeks had passed since that morning in the courthouse lobby. 3 weeks of investigations, media coverage, protests, and debates. Now everyone was gathered in a courtroom for the arraignment. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The officer who'd kicked a judge was now standing before a different judge, waiting to hear the formal charges against him. The courtroom was packed. Reporters filled the back rows. Community activists sat together on one side. A few off-duty police officers sat on the other, showing support for their colleague. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. The officer stood at the defendant's table in a suit instead of his uniform. His attorney, a well-known defense lawyer with gray hair and expensive clothes, stood beside him. The attorney had a reputation for getting police officers acquitted. He'd already given several interviews saying his client was innocent, that this was all a misunderstanding blown out of proportion. The judge presiding over the case was brought in from another county to avoid any conflicts of interest. She was known for being fair but firm. She looked down at the defendant from her bench, her expression neutral. The defendant is charged with assault and battery on a judicial officer. The clerk read aloud. This is a felony charge carrying a maximum sentence of 5 years in prison. The defense attorney stood. Your Honor, my client pleads not guilty to all charges. We believe the evidence will show this was a regrettable misunderstanding, nothing more. The prosecutor, a young but sharp attorney from the district attorney's office, stood next. Your Honor, the state believes the evidence is overwhelming. We have clear video footage, multiple witnesses, and a pattern of similar behavior from the defendant. This was not a misunderstanding. This was an unprovoked assault. The judge set a trial date for 3 months out. Bail was set, and the officer was released on his own recognizance. As he left the courtroom, reporters shouted questions. He kept his head down and said nothing. But as the case moved forward, things started to get complicated. The defense attorney filed several motions. He wanted the security footage suppressed, arguing it had been released to the media improperly. He wanted the officer's complaint history excluded from trial, saying it was prejudicial. He wanted witnesses limited in what they could testify about. The prosecutor fought back against every motion. She knew this case was important, not just legally but symbolically. People were watching. They wanted to see if the system could actually hold one of its own accountable. Then came a discovery that changed everything. The prosecutor's office found evidence that the officer had actually been in Judge Thompson's courtroom before. Twice, in fact. He'd testified in 2 different cases over the past 3 years. There was a sign-in sheet, court transcripts, photographic evidence. This destroyed the officer's defense. His whole argument was that he didn't know the man was a judge, that it was an honest mistake. But if he'd been in the judge's courtroom before, if he'd testified in front of him, then that excuse fell apart completely. The defense attorney tried to spin it. The courtroom was crowded. My client testified briefly. He had no reason to remember one specific judge from years ago. But it sounded weak, even to those who wanted to support the officer. How do you testify in someone's courtroom and not remember their face when you see them again? Especially when that person told you who they were and showed you identification? As the trial date approached, more victims started coming forward. People who'd had encounters with the officer over the years. The prosecutor couldn't use all their stories in the trial directly, but they painted a picture. A pattern of aggressive behavior. A history of making snap judgments about people based on appearance. A tendency to escalate situations unnecessarily. One man came forward with his own video from a traffic stop 2 years earlier. The officer had pulled him over for a minor violation. The video showed the officer being confrontational from the start, demanding the man get out of the car, searching the vehicle without proper cause. The man had filed a complaint that went nowhere. But now, with renewed attention, his story was being heard. A woman shared her experience of calling the police for help when her car broke down. The officer who responded was the same man now facing trial. Instead of helping, he'd questioned why she was in that neighborhood, had run her license multiple times, had treated her like a suspect instead of someone who needed assistance. The prosecutor interviewed dozens of people. She couldn't use all their stories, but she documented everything. Some people were scared to come forward publicly, afraid of retaliation. Others were angry enough that they didn't care about the risks. They wanted their stories told. The officer, meanwhile, was struggling. He'd been suspended without pay. His legal bills were mounting, even with the union covering some costs. His marriage was strained. His reputation was destroyed. When he went to the grocery store, people recognized him. Some glared. Some whispered. He started staying home most of the time. His attorney kept telling him they could win this case. It's your word against theirs. Reasonable doubt. That's all we need. But the officer was starting to wonder. He'd watched the security footage himself now. Watched it dozens of times, and even he could see how bad it looked. Judge Thompson, for his part, was preparing to testify. The prosecutor met with him several times to go over his testimony. She warned him that the defense would try to attack his credibility, to make him seem like he'd somehow provoked the situation. Just tell the truth, she advised. Tell exactly what happened, step by step. Don't embellish. Don't get emotional. Just facts, the judge nodded. He'd been on the bench long enough to know how trials worked. He knew that testifying as a victim instead of presiding as a judge would feel strange, but he was ready. The prosecutor also prepared her expert witnesses. She'd hired a psychologist who specialized in implicit bias. The expert would testify about how unconscious prejudices could affect split-second decisions. How someone could make assumptions about another person based on nothing but appearance. The defense fought to keep the expert out. This isn't about bias, the defense attorney argued in a pretrial hearing. This is about a police officer doing his job and a simple failure to recognize someone. But the judge allowed the expert testimony. Given the defendant's history of complaints and the nature of this incident, I believe this testimony is relevant. As the trial date got closer, both sides knew this case would come down to a few key questions. Did the officer know he was confronting a judge? Even if he didn't initially, why did he continue after being told and shown identification? Why did the situation escalate to physical violence? And what did his history of similar complaints say about whether this was really just a mistake? The media coverage intensified. Every cable news channel had segments about the upcoming trial. Legal experts debated the likely outcome. Some thought conviction was certain. Others argued that juries were often reluctant to convict police officers. Community organizations planned to pack the courtroom every day of the trial. They organized a schedule so that activists could take turns attending, ensuring there was always a presence. They wanted the jury to see that people cared about this case, that it mattered. The police union held a rally in support of their officer. About 100 officers showed up in uniform. The union president gave a speech about how difficult police work was, how officers had to make split-second decisions, how they deserved the benefit of the doubt. But even some officers were conflicted. Off the record, several admitted they were embarrassed by what had happened. That's not how we're supposed to do things, one veteran officer said anonymously. He made us all look bad. The prosecutor spent late nights preparing. She reviewed every piece of evidence again and again. The security footage, the witness statements, the officer's personnel file, the body camera videos from previous incidents. She built her case carefully, knowing that every detail mattered. The defense attorney did the same. He looked for any weakness in the prosecution's case, any inconsistency in witness statements, any technical error in how evidence was collected. He knew his client was facing serious time if convicted. He had to find something. The night before the trial, Judge Thompson couldn't sleep. He kept replaying that morning in his mind, kept wondering what he could have done differently. Could he have de-escalated the situation somehow? Should he have just walked away when the officer first approached? His wife found him sitting in the living room at 2 in the morning. "You couldn't have changed what happened," she said softly. "That man made his own choices." "I know," the judge replied. "But I keep thinking about all the people this has happened to, who don't have the platform I have, who filed complaints that were ignored, who were treated this way and had no recourse. That's why this trial matters," she said. "That's why you have to testify. Not just for yourself, but for all of them." The next morning, as the sun rose over the courthouse, people were already lining up outside. The trial that everyone had been waiting for was finally about to begin. Security was tight, emotions were high, and everyone knew that whatever happened in that courtroom over the next few weeks would have implications far beyond just one officer and one judge. The courtroom was completely silent as the prosecutor stood to give her opening statement. Every seat was filled. People stood along the back wall. Outside, more people who couldn't get in waited, hoping for updates. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," the prosecutor began, her voice clear and confident. "Over the next few days, you're going to see something that shouldn't be possible in America. You're going to watch a video of a police officer assaulting a judge in a courthouse. Not because the judge did anything wrong. Not because there was any threat, but because the officer made assumptions, because he let his biases control his actions, and because when he was proven wrong, he couldn't admit it." She walked toward the jury box, making eye contact with each juror. "The defense is going to tell you this was a mistake, a misunderstanding. They're going to ask you to believe that an officer who had testified in Judge Thompson's courtroom twice before somehow didn't recognize him. They're going to ask you to ignore a pattern of complaints stretching back years. But the evidence doesn't lie. The video doesn't lie, and by the end of this trial, you'll see the truth." The defense attorney stood next. He was older, experienced, and he knew how to work a jury. "Reasonable doubt," he said simply. "That's what this case is about. My client is a police officer who has served this community for 12 years. He puts his life on the line every single day. And on the morning in question, he was doing his job. He saw someone who didn't belong, someone who couldn't properly identify themselves. A few people in the courtroom made sounds of disbelief, but the judge quickly called for order. The defense attorney continued. "Was it a mistake? Yes. Did things escalate further than they should have? Yes, but that doesn't make it a crime. Police work is difficult. Split-second decisions. High stress. And my client is human. He made an error in judgment, but he didn't commit assault, not with criminal intent, and that's what the law requires for conviction." The first witness was one of the security guards who'd been working that morning. He was nervous, clearly uncomfortable being in the spotlight, but his testimony was straightforward. "I've worked at that courthouse for 8 years," he said. "I know Judge Thompson. Everyone who works there knows him. When I saw what was happening, I tried to tell the officer who he was confronting, but he wouldn't listen." The prosecutor showed him photos from the security footage. "Is this what you saw?" "Yes, ma'am." "That's exactly what I saw." On cross-examination, the defense attorney tried to poke holes. "The lobby was crowded that morning, correct?" "Yes, sir." "Lots of noise? People moving around?" "Yes, sir." "Is it possible my client simply didn't hear you clearly when you identified Judge Thompson?" The security guard shook his head. "No, sir. I was standing right there. He heard me. He just didn't believe me." Next came the other witnesses. The bailiff who'd been nearby, the lawyers who'd watched the confrontation, the other security guard. Each one told the same story. The officer had been aggressive from the start. The judge had been calm and cooperative. The situation had escalated unnecessarily. The prosecutor showed the security footage. The jury watched in complete silence. You could see everything clearly. The judge showing his ID, the officer refusing to believe him, the security guard confirming who he was, and then the grab, the shove, the kick. Several jurors winced when they saw the kick. One woman shook her head slightly. The defense attorney noticed and made a note. He'd have to address that reaction in his closing argument. On the second day, it was Judge Thompson's turn to testify. The courtroom was even more packed than the first day. Everyone wanted to hear directly from him. He took the oath and sat down. He looked calm, professional. But if you looked closely, you could see his hand gripping the armrest of the witness chair a little too tightly. The prosecutor walked him through that morning step by step. What time he arrived. Why he used the public entrance. His first interaction with the officer. What did you think when he first approached you? She asked. I thought maybe there was some kind of security alert I wasn't aware of, Judge Thompson said, so I cooperated fully. I showed him my ID, I explained who I was. And what was his response? He didn't believe me. He said the ID could be fake. He demanded to search my briefcase. How did that make you feel? The defense attorney stood. Objection. The victim's feelings aren't relevant. The judge presiding over the trial considered for a moment. I'll allow it. He may answer. Judge Thompson looked at the jury. I felt confused at first, then frustrated, then honestly a little scared. Because I was doing everything right. I was being cooperative and respectful. But nothing I said mattered. And I realized that if this could happen to me, a judge in a courthouse, what must happen to regular people on the street? The defense attorney's cross-examination was aggressive. He tried to suggest that Judge Thompson had been confrontational, that he'd escalated the situation. Isn't it true that you tried to walk away from my client multiple times? Yes, because he had no legal reason to detain me. I'd identified myself. I was going to my chambers to do my job. And you're used to people doing what you say, aren't you? As a judge? I'm used to people following the law, yes. My client was following the law. He was checking someone who appeared suspicious. Judge Thompson's composure cracked just slightly. I appeared suspicious? I was carrying a briefcase to work in a courthouse. What exactly was suspicious about that? The defense attorney had no good answer to that question. On day 3, the prosecutor brought in the expert on implicit bias. The psychologist explained how unconscious prejudices could affect decision-making, how someone could make snap judgments based on appearance without even realizing it. These biases aren't necessarily conscious, the expert testified. Someone doesn't have to be deliberately prejudiced for bias to affect their actions. It can happen automatically, especially in high-stress situations or when someone is making quick decisions. The defense attorney tried to discredit the testimony. So you're saying my client is a mind reader? That you know what he was thinking? No, the expert replied calmly. I'm saying that based on his pattern of behavior, as documented in complaints and body camera footage, there appears to be a consistent pattern of treating certain people more aggressively than others. Then the prosecutor did something that made the defense attorney very nervous. She called several people who'd filed complaints about the officer in the past. The judge had ruled they could testify about their experiences to establish a pattern. One by one, they took the stand and told their stories. The man who'd been stopped while walking in his own neighborhood, the woman who'd called for help and been treated like a criminal, the teenager who'd been searched without cause, the businessman who'd been pulled over and questioned extensively despite having done nothing wrong. The defense attorney objected repeatedly. Your Honor, these incidents aren't on trial here, but the judge allowed the testimony. The defense has argued this was an isolated mistake. The prosecution has the right to show a pattern of similar behavior. The most powerful testimony came from a former colleague of the officer, another cop who'd worked with him for years. He looked uncomfortable testifying, like he was betraying some unwritten code by being there. I liked him personally, the officer testified. He could be a good guy. But yeah, I saw how he treated certain people differently. We talked about it. Some of us tried to tell him to ease up, but he didn't listen. Can you give an example? The prosecutor asked. Once we responded to a call about a suspicious person in a parking lot. Turned out it was a doctor who worked at the hospital there. He was taking a break sitting in his car, but before we even approached, before we knew anything, my partner, he gestured toward the defendant, said something that bothered me. He said, "This guy doesn't belong here." I asked what he meant. He couldn't really explain it. Just a feeling, he said. The defense attorney did his best to rehabilitate his client. He called character witnesses, fellow officers who said the defendant was a good cop, neighbors who said he was friendly and helpful. He tried to paint a picture of a dedicated public servant who'd made one mistake under stressful circumstances. But it rang hollow against the weight of the evidence. Finally, the officer himself took the stand. His attorney had debated whether to put him up there, knowing it was risky. But they felt they had no choice. The jury needed to hear from him. He started well enough, talking about his years of service, the dangerous calls he'd responded to, the times he'd helped people. But then the prosecutor got her turn. You testified in Judge Thompson's courtroom before, didn't you? I don't remember. You don't remember? We have sign-in sheets. Court transcripts. You testified in 2 cases in his courtroom over the past 3 years. I testify in a lot of cases. So you're saying you didn't recognize him that morning? No, I didn't. The prosecutor pulled out a photo from one of those previous court appearances. This is you testifying, and this is Judge Thompson on the bench. You were looking right at him as you testified. And you expect this jury to believe you didn't recognize him? The officer's face was red. I don't study judges' faces. I was focused on my testimony. Then why didn't you believe him when he told you who he was? Why didn't you believe the security guard? The courtroom filled back up quickly. Word had spread that the jury had reached a decision after only 4 hours of deliberation. That was fast. Too fast for the defense. When juries deliberate for days, it often means they're divided, debating, considering different perspectives. 4 hours meant they'd made up their minds quickly. The officer sat at the defense table, his hands clasped together tightly. For the first time since this whole thing started, he looked genuinely scared. His attorney sat beside him, trying to appear confident, but you could see the tension in his shoulders. On the other side of the courtroom, Judge Thompson sat with his wife and the prosecutor. He looked calm, but his wife held his hand tightly under the table. The prosecutor stared straight ahead, her face giving nothing away. The jury filed in, none of them looking at the defendant. That was another bad sign for the defense. When juries have to deliver a guilty verdict, they often avoid eye contact with the person they're about to convict. The judge presiding over the trial looked at the jury foreman. Has the jury reached a verdict? The foreman, a middle-aged man who'd been an engineer before retiring, stood up. Yes, Your Honor, we have. What say you? In the matter of the State versus Officer Peterson, on the charge of assault and battery on a judicial officer, we find the defendant guilty. The courtroom erupted. Some people cheered. Others gasped. A few officers sitting in support of their colleague shook their heads in disbelief. The judge had to bang her gavel 3 times to restore order. The officer's face went pale. He turned to his attorney, whispering urgently. The attorney put a hand on his shoulder, trying to calm him. But there was nothing calming about what had just happened. A guilty verdict on a felony charge meant prison time. It meant losing his job, his pension, everything he'd worked for over 12 years. Judge Thompson closed his eyes briefly. His wife squeezed his hand harder. It wasn't joy he felt. It was more like relief mixed with sadness. Relief that justice had been done. Sadness that it had come to this. That someone who was supposed to serve and protect had instead abused their power so badly. The presiding judge thanked the jury for their service and set a sentencing date for 6 weeks out. The officer was remanded into custody until then. As the bailiffs approached to take him away, he looked back at his wife sitting in the gallery. She was crying, her hands covering her face. It was the first time he'd let himself feel the full weight of what he'd done, not just to Judge Thompson, but to his own family, his own life. As they let him out, the courtroom slowly emptied. Reporters rushed out to file their stories. Community activists gathered outside, celebrating the verdict but acknowledging there was still more work to be done. The prosecutor gave a brief statement to the press, thanking the jury and emphasizing that the justice system had worked as it should. Judge Thompson declined to speak to reporters that night. He just wanted to go home, to process what had happened, to think about what came next. Over the following 6 weeks, both sides prepared for sentencing. The prosecution compiled a detailed report on the officer's history, the impact of his actions, and the need for a strong sentence to send a message. The defense gathered letters from family members, fellow officers, and community members who knew the defendant outside of his uniform. The officer sat in jail during this time. He'd been denied bail pending sentencing due to the serious nature of the conviction. It gave him a lot of time to think about his choices, about his career, about all the warning signs he'd ignored, the complaints he'd dismissed as people just being difficult, the supervisors who'd warned him to change his ways. He'd thought he was untouchable. He'd been wrong. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning. Another full courtroom, another media circus. But the tone was different now. Less anticipation, more solemnity. Everyone knew this was the final chapter. Before the judge announced the sentence, she allowed victim impact statements. Judge Thompson had prepared remarks. He stood at the podium looking directly at the officer for the first time since the verdict. I want to address not just what happened to me, he began, but what this case represents. I'm a judge. I have a title, credibility, resources. When I said I was assaulted, people listened. When I filed a complaint, it was taken seriously. But how many people don't have those advantages? How many people have been treated exactly like I was treated, or worse, and had nowhere to turn? He paused, letting his words sink in. I've spent 15 years on the bench trying to ensure justice is applied fairly. And in one morning, I experienced what countless people experience regularly. The feeling of being judged not by your actions but by your appearance. The fear that comes from knowing that someone with power and authority has already decided who you are before you've even spoken. The officer looked down at his hands, unable to meet Judge Thompson's gaze. I don't take pleasure in anyone's suffering, Judge Thompson continued, but accountability matters. For too long, officers with patterns of misconduct have been protected, shuffled around, given chance after chance while their victims are dismissed and forgotten. This has to stop, not just for me, but for every person who deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of what they look like or where they come from. He sat back down. Several others gave statements too. People who'd been victims of the officer's behavior in the past. Their stories were powerful. A single mother who'd been harassed during a traffic stop with her kids in the car. An elderly man who'd called for help and been treated like a criminal. Each story added to the picture of someone who'd abused their authority repeatedly. Then the defense attorney spoke, pleading for leniency. Your Honor, my client has already lost everything. His career is over. His reputation is destroyed. His family is suffering. Prison time beyond what's necessary serves no purpose. The presiding judge listened to everything carefully. When everyone had spoken, she addressed the courtroom. This case has been difficult for everyone involved, she began. A police officer is convicted of assaulting a judge in a courthouse. It's almost unthinkable, but the evidence was clear and the jury has spoken. She looked at the defendant. Officer Peterson, you were given a badge and a gun. You were entrusted with protecting your community. People are supposed to be able to trust you, to rely on you. Instead, you let your biases and your ego dictate your actions. You had multiple opportunities to de-escalate the situation with Judge Thompson. You chose not to. And this wasn't an isolated incident. The pattern of complaints against you shows this was how you operated routinely. The officer's attorney had argued for a sentence of probation and community service. The prosecutor had asked for 4 years in prison. The courtroom waited to hear what the judge would decide. Sentencing must accomplish several things, she continued. Punishment, yes, but also deterrence. And in this case, a message needs to be sent. Police officers who abuse their authority must be held accountable. She announced the sentence, 3 years in state prison, plus 2 years of supervised probation upon release, mandatory participation in bias training and anger management programs, and permanent revocation of his law enforcement certification. 3 years. It was more than the defense had hoped for, but less than the prosecution had requested. The officer showed emotion for the first time since the trial began. His shoulders shook. He put his head in his hands. 3 years in prison. 3 years away from his family. And when he got out, he'd be a convicted felon who could never work in law enforcement again. But the consequences didn't end with his prison sentence. Within hours of the sentencing, the police department held a press conference announcing his termination. Even though he'd been suspended since the incident, the formal termination meant losing all benefits, including his pension, 12 years of contributions gone. Then came the civil lawsuits. Judge Thompson filed a lawsuit against both the officer and the police department for the assault, and for the department's failure to address the officer's pattern of misconduct. The city's insurance company quickly pushed for settlement talks. They knew they couldn't win. The evidence was overwhelming. Within weeks, they settled for $2.3 million. But more importantly than the money, the settlement included mandatory reforms. The police department had to implement comprehensive bias training for all officers. They had to revise their complaint procedures to ensure complaints were actually investigated properly. They had to establish a civilian oversight board with real power to review use of force incidents. And they had to publish annual reports on officer complaints and disciplinary actions. Other victims of the officer's past behavior filed their own lawsuits. Most settled quietly. The city was on the hook for millions more in damages. It was expensive, embarrassing, but necessary. The police chief, who'd been criticized for not acting sooner on the complaints against the officer, announced his retirement 6 months after the sentencing. It wasn't officially connected, but everyone knew. He'd failed to address a problem officer, and that failure had cost the city dearly. For the officer himself, prison was a harsh reality check. He was placed in general population, and other inmates knew who he was. Former cops don't have an easy time in prison, especially when they're there for assaulting a judge. 2 years had passed since that morning in the courthouse lobby. 2 years since a routine day turned into something that changed multiple lives forever. The city looked the same on the surface, but underneath, things had shifted in ways both big and small. Judge Thompson stood at the podium in a university lecture hall, looking out at 200 law students. This had become a regular part of his life. Now, speaking, teaching, sharing the lessons from an experience he never wanted but couldn't ignore. Law is only as good as the people who enforce it, he told the students. You can write perfect statutes, create ideal procedures, design the most fair system imaginable. But if the people implementing it bring bias, ego, or indifference to their work, the system fails. A young woman in the front row raised her hand. Do you think what happened to you has actually changed anything? Or was it just one case? It was a fair question. One he'd asked himself many times. Both, he answered honestly. One case can't fix everything, but it can start conversations. It can force institutions to look at themselves. Whether those changes stick, whether they spread beyond one city, that depends on all of us continuing to push for better. After the lecture, students lined up to talk with him. Some wanted to discuss the case. Others shared their own experiences with injustice. A young man told him about his brother being harassed by police. A woman described watching her father get pulled over repeatedly in their own neighborhood. These conversations were why Judge Thompson kept speaking, even when it was exhausting to relive that day over and over. Across town, in a medium-security prison, the former officer sat in a small classroom. It was part of the rehabilitation program he was required to attend. Today's session was about community relations and understanding different perspectives. 2 years into his sentence, with 1 year left to go, he'd changed in ways his former colleagues wouldn't recognize. The facilitator, a social worker who'd been running these programs for years, asked the group a question. What would you do differently if you could go back? The former officer had heard this question before. Early on, his answer had been defensive. He'd talk about procedure, about how he was just following his training, about how things got out of hand. But that wasn't his answer anymore. Everything, he said quietly. I'd do everything differently. Not just that morning, but the whole 12 years before it. I'd actually listen when people tried to tell me I was wrong. I'd look at myself honestly instead of blaming everyone else. I'd understand that the badge didn't make me better than anyone. It was supposed to mean I had a responsibility to be better. The other men in the program nodded. Most of them weren't former police officers, but they all understood regret. Understanding what you did wrong when it was too late to fix it. After the session, he returned to his cell. He'd started keeping a journal, something the counselor had suggested. Writing down his thoughts helped him process everything. Today, he wrote about a memory that had surfaced during the session. A traffic stop from years ago where he'd treated someone roughly for no good reason. At the time, he'd justified it. Now looking back, he could see it clearly. He'd made assumptions, let his biases guide his actions. That person had filed a complaint that went nowhere. He wondered where that person was now, if they still thought about that encounter, if they'd lost faith in police because of officers like him. Meanwhile, back at the police department, real changes were taking place. The new chief, brought in after the previous one retired, had implemented the reforms required by the settlement. But more than that, she'd changed the culture. Officer training now included extensive sessions on bias recognition and de-escalation. Not just one-time classes, but ongoing training throughout officers' careers. The department partnered with community organizations to help officers understand the neighborhoods they served. And perhaps most importantly, the complaint process had been overhauled completely. A civilian oversight board now reviewed every use of force complaint. They had real power to investigate, to demand answers, to recommend discipline. Officers couldn't just dismiss complaints anymore. Their supervisors couldn't sweep problems under the rug. Everything was documented, tracked, and reviewed by people outside the department. Some of the older officers resisted. They complained that the new rules made it harder to do their jobs, that they had to second-guess every decision, that the oversight board didn't understand the realities of police work. But the younger officers, the ones who joined after the incident, seemed to get it. They understood that accountability wasn't the enemy of good policing, that treating people with respect didn't make them weak, that the badge came with responsibility, not just authority. The chief held monthly community meetings. At first, attendance was sparse. People didn't trust that anything would really change. But slowly, as they saw actual reforms being implemented, more people started showing up, asking questions, sharing concerns, building relationships with the officers who patrolled their neighborhoods. One evening at one of these meetings, an elderly man stood up to speak. "I've lived in this city for 70 years, he said, and I never thought I'd see the day when police would actually listen to us, when complaints would be taken seriously, when there would be real consequences for officers who abuse their power. It took something terrible happening to a judge for people to pay attention. That's not right, but at least something good came from it. The foundation that Judge Thompson had established was making a difference too. It had helped dozens of people file complaints and pursue legal action when they were treated unfairly by police. It provided free legal assistance to those who couldn't afford attorneys. And it documented patterns of misconduct that might otherwise go unnoticed. A young lawyer who worked for the foundation told Judge Thompson about a recent case. We helped a family whose son was roughed up during a traffic stop. Before, they would have filed a complaint that went nowhere. But now, with the new oversight system and with our legal support, the officer was actually disciplined, not fired, but suspended and required to undergo additional training. It's not perfect, but it's progress. Judge Thompson nodded. He knew that real change was slow. That one case, one verdict, one set of reforms couldn't fix everything overnight. But you had to start somewhere. His wife noticed the changes in him too. He was more passionate about his work now, but also more tired. The speaking engagements, the foundation work, the advocacy, it was all on top of his regular duties as a judge. You need to slow down, she told him one evening over dinner. You can't fix everything yourself. I know, he replied. But I can't just go back to normal either. Not after everything that happened. I have a platform now. People listen when I speak. How can I not use that?
I'm not saying don't use it.
I'm saying pace yourself. This is a marathon, not a sprint. She was right, of course. He'd been pushing himself too hard. But it was difficult to slow down when there was so much work to be done. The media attention had faded, as it always does. The case that had dominated headlines for weeks was now old news. Reporters had moved on to other stories. But the people affected by what happened hadn't moved on. They were still living with the consequences, good and bad. The officer's family struggled. His wife had to find work to support their kids. His children faced bullying at school when other kids found out who their father was. They had to move to a different neighborhood, start over somewhere people didn't recognize them. It wasn't fair to them, but it was the reality they faced. His wife visited him in prison every week. The visits were hard, sitting in that sterile room, talking through a phone with glass between them, watching their kids grow up without their father. She was angry at him for what he'd done, angry that he'd thrown away their life together. But she was also trying to hold the family together, to help their children understand that people make mistakes, that their father was still their father even though he'd done something terrible. During one visit, he asked her, "Do you think you'll still be here when I get out?" She was quiet for a long time. "I don't know," she finally said. "I'm here now. We'll see what happens when you're released." It was an honest answer, and he appreciated that. He'd destroyed a lot of trust. Rebuilding it, if it was even possible, would take time. As his release date approached, he started thinking about what came next. He couldn't be a police officer anymore. His law enforcement certification was permanently revoked. He was a convicted felon, which limited his employment options significantly. He'd need to find work, rebuild his life, somehow move forward. The prison counselor helped him prepare. "You're going to face a lot of challenges," she told him. "Finding work, reconnecting with your family, dealing with people who recognize you from the news. It won't be easy." "I know," he said, "but I have to try. I can't change what I did. I can only try to be better going forward." When he was finally released, stepping out of the prison into the fresh air after 3 years, His wife and kids were there waiting. The reunion was emotional, complicated. His kids had grown so much. His daughter was a teenager now. His son barely remembered him. He hugged them tightly, fighting back tears. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry for everything."